Like, it is incredibly easy for me to condemn the brutality against civilians by Hamas and by the far-right Israeli government and the IDF. I don't know why it's so hard for people who support Israel to do the same, right? You can support the right for Israel to exist as a nation state and for the civilian population in Israel for being safe. Why is it so hard for you to do the same when it comes to Palestinians? To oppose Hamas but support the Palestinian civilians, half of which are children. Why is this so difficult? It's almost like there's an agenda here. It's almost like people have bought into the PR, the propaganda framing of Palestine as all being members of Hamas, all being terrorists, and therefore all fair game for essentially death in war because they don't want Palestine to exist. Because they don't want Palestinians to exist. Because they want a one-state solution where Israel is the only state and Palestine is just a memory. So if you've been watching my stream for at least a month, literally just a month, you may have remembered this here video, which is completely unrelated to the topic that we're about to talk about, but happened to go over it. Here's this jackwagon talking about it in a YouTube short that somehow made its way onto my YouTube channel. Conservatives, they'll talk about, oh, well, you're so mad about the homophobia in America. Well, why don't you go to Saudi Arabia where they throw you off of rooftops if you're gay? And it's like, okay, man, but like, you kind of seem to agree with them on a lot of policy positions. True, and you know, you can see all that if you watch that other video or watch this YouTube short. And wouldn't I know it, you know, Constradamus has predicted it yet again that this was going to come up within a month. And it has. So we have, of course, Israel's disproportionate and aggressive response to the terror attacks committed by Hamas that has bridged far beyond any kind of reasonable response, which we'll get into. If you've watched my, channel for a while, it's always been Free Palestine around here. You've also known that I'm not a big fan of Hamas, nor am I a big fan of the far-right Zionist government in Israel. Not a big fan of either of those, and I've always supported progressive Israelis and Jewish people in Israel and around the world who oppose their far-right Zionist government, because they do exist, and they are doing some of the hardest work, not only in Israel, but also in the United States and other countries. And I also support Palestinians that are anti-Hamas, because contrary to popular belief, not every single person who happens to live in Gaza is part of a terror group. As much as the far-right Israeli government wants you to believe that, not actually true. And I support those in Palestine who are against that and who are simply fighting for their own dignity as human beings and their right to exist. Turns out we have a lot of people on the right concern trolling, pretending to care about the plight of gay people in a very easily seen through way, very transparent way, where, you'll have people talk about, oh, well, there's a bunch of queer people advocating for Free Palestine. Wow, well, if you went to Palestine, you would, they don't really like the gays, and you're gonna have some trouble there. And it's like, yeah, but for one, we already oppose that. For two, queer people already exist in Palestine and have to suffer under that reality. And for three, you kind of agree with them. The ones that are opposing gay people, you're kind of in the same boat with them. So you can't really pretend that this is something you care about, and you can't really try to weaponize it because you're Islamophobic and don't like Muslims, or people from a majority Muslim country, because I'm sure not every person in Palestine is, a follower of Islam. I'm sure there are atheists in Palestine and Israel. You can't really be doing that when you're kind of jealous of these far-right regimes that are not very friendly to queer people, because you're doing a lot of the same things that they would do in the lead up to the very extreme stuff that they're doing. So they might not throw gay people off of the rooftops in the United States of America, but the Republican Party in this country is currently trying to legislate a variety of their rights away. They have always opposed gay marriage. They have always supported anti-sodomy laws, which is essentially just trying to criminalize gay sex, which is incredibly hard to actually enforce in actual letter of the law kind of way, because what are you going to have? Like a government monitor in the bedroom of a gay couple. So they end up having to do shit like looking at their internet history, like watching them as they're out and about, seeing if they're holding a hand of another man. Well, they're likely, doing the gay butt stuff, so we could probably get them for the, it's some stupid bullshit. It's just a way to make gay people less comfortable in society. It's very Orwellian as well. So you're kind of jealous of these people. You can't really bring this shit up, but we're seeing it a lot when it comes to Israel-Palestine. So, as Bolsonaro, Liam, on Twitter wrote, right-wingers hate, quote, queers for Palestine type stuff because they're homophobic and racist, but also because they can't imagine unconditional solidarity. Supporting someone not because you feel you get something in return, but because it's the right thing to do. That's very true. Also, Osita, who's a really fucking good writer of words on the internet for the New Republic, for the Guardian, etc., also wrote in a quote, "It's conservatism. You're supposed to have elemental loyalty to people and communities that are like you, not a broad solidarity with all mankind based on universal ideals, which are potentially destructive to stable society and aren't to be trusted. Essentially, conservatives want hierarchies and oppose anything that flattens those hierarchies." This is very true. I feel like we've gone over this on stream before, maybe not in this pointed of a way, and maybe not with these kinds of like readily apparent and recent examples, but that's absolutely true. Right-wingers cannot fathom the idea of queer people in the United States of America who might oppose anti-queer laws in, say, Saudi Arabia, but still support the liberation of queer people in Saudi Arabia. I don't know how that works, but somehow they twist their minds into a pretzel trying to figure that out. And for a more direct comparison, in Palestine, because they don't think queer people exist anywhere but in so-called Western developed countries, because they think that it's unnatural and just like a fad or whatever that you can only possibly come into contact with if you're in a privileged situation like in a Western country. Even though while you are privileged in America, you're not as privileged unless you're very wealthy, which queer people demographically, statistically are not. Regardless, obviously it doesn't make sense because it doesn't have to make sense. They just want to be able to dehumanize queer people and the people they don't like in order to justify oppression against them. Very simple. But this is something they just can't wrap their minds around because they've been propagandized to their entire lives into believing is impossible. Because if they were to believe that you could be in solidarity with people, even if you don't fully agree with everything they think or believe, they wouldn't be conservatives anymore. It would be very difficult for them to be if they actually understood those contradictions that operate within their minds on a daily basis. The right-wing political project and the powers in the Republican Party and other conservative governments and movements require people to not be able to understand this concept, which is why they are very, very vociferously opposed to any kind of social movement, civil rights movement, left-wing and leftist movement, because those kinds of views, being able to do this and have solidarity with people like that, are a pivotal aspect of this kind of movement on the left. They need you to not be able to believe that, because to give people the option of a potentially better world is scary to them, There has to be a common enemy, there has to be rotating villains, there has to be something to be afraid of in order to control the masses in the conservative movement. Otherwise, they start losing their stranglehold on the people, and they start losing their power. So in another very clear example of this, you have Ron DeSantis talking about, the anti-Semitism in Palestine and Hamas, which I assume he thinks everybody in Palestine is a member of Hamas. That's too much, and you can't have people from Gaza coming into the United States because you can't have that anti-Semitism here. Oh, wow. You like free Palestine? Well, there's a lot of anti-Semitism there, so it's kind of hypocrisy, is it not? And it's not. But very obviously, he doesn't actually care about it, because he's had people on his staff who have made videos for his official, campaign accounts that had a literal Nazi Sonnenrad overlaid over his face. Literally for 5 seconds, not even like a quick flash of it, was posted to the DeSantis War Room or whatever, which is an account that I believe is directly affiliated with his campaign. Not only that, but he has constant neo-Nazi presence in Florida with literal, DeSantis country, with Florida placed in such a way that it makes a swastika, This campaign is friendly to neo-Nazis. Very obviously. At least the neo-Nazis seem to think so. I'm not saying every DeSantis supporter is a Nazi. I'm just saying every Nazi supports Ron DeSantis. This is the most clear way I can give you evidence of this idea. Olaymi also had a really good tweet on this. The sheer amount of people who quite literally support, mingle with, and pal around with white supremacists who spew anti-Semitism all year round, suddenly pretending to care about Jews or Israel as an excuse to celebrate the murder of brown Palestinian people is sick. They're also using this as an excuse to get off their usual hate for black people and BLM, so transparent. It's very true. It's the same thing for that too, right? There always needs to be an opportunity for the right to pit marginalized groups against each other. So in the case of what we initially started talking about, they're trying to pit brown people in Palestine and Muslims against queer people in America. Queer people in America who support the liberation of Palestine from the apartheid conditions and the subjugation and oppression that they face from the far-right Israeli Zionist government. They need to be able to pit black people against Palestinians as well. They need to be able to pit working class white people, even poor white people, against Ukrainians, for instance, or against Palestinians by like, oh, well, we can't have our money go to Ukraine to support their defense against Russia invading them because we need to spend that money back home. And then when we get to try to spend that money back home on social programs, free school lunches for kids, expanding Medicare so that more people can get health care, they vote against it every time. The only thing they actually support reallocating those funds to is giving them to the mega wealthy and cutting the regulations on multinational corporations so that you have to work longer for less wages and worse conditions, and they get to take home more of your labor money, you know. It's the same shit every time. It is only through the sheer force of propaganda and manufactured consent through our media that the Republican Party has any kind of political relevancy whatsoever, along with the political participation trophies that are gerrymandering, voter suppression, and the Electoral College. Anyway, to go on to the broader conversation on Israel-Palestine, because I haven't posted on YouTube about it yet. I've been posting a lot on Twitter since, shit started popping off, but I haven't posted on YouTube about it yet, so I figure I will now. I usually like to wait about these things. Obviously, people don't come to me for foreign policy analysis, and foreign policy is very complicated, oftentimes, and has a lot of moving parts, so I like to wait as well before giving a lot of major critiques or, very, granular conversations on it. But just as a quick note, the death toll on either side has been massively disproportionate on the side of Palestinians dying. And it's factual information. Now, of course, the Hamas terror attacks that I obviously condemn and have to obviously condemn every time I talk about it, even though I've condemned it 18 times, the 19th time I talk about it, I'm going to have to condemn them again. And for reasons we'll get into, there's a very specific reason why people feel the need to do that. And it's because they've been forced into doing it by certain rhetorical and PR strategies. But very simply and very plainly, for the amount of people who lost their lives in Israel, the Israelis who lost their lives, it pales in comparison to the far-right Israeli government's response. In an update, as of 17 hours ago at the time of filming, more than 1,030 Palestinian children in Gaza have been killed by Israeli forces since October 7th, or about one child every 15 minutes, and more than 1/3 of the total death toll. So unless you're going to make the argument that those 1,030 children were going to grow up to be in Hamas, which is an absurd take that actually Zionists and the Israeli government have actually made, they call it mowing the grass, by taking out Palestinians that are younger, children, because they may become Hamas members in the future. You never know. You might as well get them while they're young. Unless you think they're all part of Hamas, which you cannot make an actual logical argument for, this is completely brutal and unnecessary and just completely bloodthirsty response. There's no actual justification for this. There isn't. So the idea that you could say, well, Israel has a right to defend itself in response to this is a joke. It's just a thought-terminating cliche. Of course, every nation-state has a right to defend itself. That also includes Palestine. Now, I'm not saying what Hamas did was defending Palestine. I'm saying it was the opposite, actually, and that it put Palestinians that are not part of Hamas or sympathetic to Hamas in harm's way. But I'm saying that the civilians in Palestine have a right to defend themselves from the ongoing oppression and apartheid conditions that the far-right Israeli government subjects them to. Much the same way that Israel does have a right to try to take out members of Hamas when they aggress on them, right? The problem is that members of Hamas thing is not very clearly defined by the far-right Israeli government, nor mainstream media even, because there has been an ongoing project to equate literally every single Palestinian civilian of the 2 million people that live in Gaza, half of which are children. There has been an ongoing project to equate all of those people with Hamas, which is not true, very obviously, but they do that in order to justify this kind of bloodshed, because this is just Palestinian children, right? There's been over 2,000 Palestinians who have died in response, and half of these are children. So the idea that you can use this as an argument is absurd, but that's what it is. That's always the response whenever the IDF commits any kind of atrocity against Palestinians. It's like, oh, well, Israel has a right to defend themselves because they equate every single Palestinian with Hamas. Just release the hostages. Talk to Hamas about that, man. I don't support them. I don't have a direct line to them. I don't know what you want me to do with that. The majority of Palestinians would love to see those hostages released if it's going to end the bloodshed. The problem is it's not going to end the bloodshed. The bloodshed has been ongoing. The IDF routinely kills civilians and children even before this recent Hamas terror attack. So that's not even going to end it. Anyway. I go on to say the far-right Israeli government clearly doesn't see Palestinians as full human beings, and they literally haven't, because I believe the defense minister for Israel literally called Palestinians human animals. when he stated that they were going to cut off food, electricity, and water to the Palestinian civilians, which is definitionally collective punishment, which is a war crime. Also, funny that the Israeli government has the ability to cut off that essential infrastructure to Palestine. You would think that that would be under the domain of Palestinians, but it's not and never has been. Israel has literally always had the option to cut off those necessary infrastructural needs and have often leveraged that against Palestine because it is an apartheid state. Palestinians do not have full rights as human beings where they live. The Israeli state obviously wants a one-state solution where Palestine ceases to exist, and that's the only way you could possibly justify so many dead children. There is no other way, and that's not a good justification, mind you. Owen Jones tweeted, in response to this Al Jazeera report, every living generation of 45 families wiped off of the face of the earth by the Israeli state in Palestine. So 45 families have been wiped off the Gaza Civil Registry, says the Gaza Health Ministry. 45 families gone. Now you're going to tell me that all of those are members of Hamas, because you're going to have to provide some evidence for that. And I know you don't have it. If this was a headline about Putin's airstrikes in Ukraine, it'd rightly be held up as evidence of his evil, but the West is cheering on this massacre. Now, they have been recently turning heel a little bit, now that, they're being forced to reckon with the fact that the majority of the casualties here are fucking children and not members of Hamas. They are turning heel and having to issue, limp-wristed apologies with no actual substance. But, the damage is done. The consent was manufactured. They gleefully went along with the propaganda project by the far-right Zionist Israeli state to dehumanize Palestinians and essentially pave the way for this bloodshed to be justified. So the source here is from the United Nations, and I believe this is total deaths from 2008 to 2020, not even to go into the recent war that Israel is aggressing on Palestine. Israeli and Palestinian deaths and injuries documented by the UN. Palestinian deaths and injuries pale by comparison, because there is a very obvious imbalance between the two by the design of the Israeli far-right government. There's no equivacy here. But of course, people are going to go on to defend, like this dumbass in my chat, calling 1,000 children dead a so-called casualty of war, which is just a fucking heinous statement. The Israeli defense minister, Yoav Gallant, said, quote, I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we will act accordingly. The higher-ups in the Israeli government do not see Palestinians as full human beings, and therefore, they find it justified to kill 1,000 children and, adult civilians in Palestine. And they have the power to do so. Because not only will people immediately die at the hands of IDF soldiers and bombings, but they'll also die from dehydration, from starvation, from heat stroke. Potentially. I wrote, love how Israel's far-right leadership just openly says, yeah, we think Palestinians are subhuman, we're going to war crime them, and people have the gall to say they're just defending themselves. And once again, because you have to add the caveat every time, Israelis are not inherently far-right Zionists like their government, and to suggest so is anti-Semitic. Palestinians are not inherently far-right Hamas supporters, and to suggest so is Islamophobic. Israel's response has been disproportionate on an unfathomable scale because they wanted an excuse, and that is my firm belief. They absolutely wanted an excuse because they do not want Palestine to exist. They do not think Palestine has a right to exist. And they do not think that Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. They want a one-state solution where it's just Israel and Palestine no longer exists. That's it. And they're willing to justify all manner of atrocities in order to make that happen. Your rightful condemnation of Hamas means nothing if you continue to support the far-right Israeli government, whose current goal is the elimination of the Palestinian people. There's no way you can logic your way out of this. And this was even before. 447 children and 248 women among the 1,417 killed in Israeli strikes in Gaza as of October 12, 2023, Reuters reported. Is this enough innocent kids and civilians for you to finally get back at Hamas? Is this enough for the atrocities that Hamas committed? Because it is way more. You got more numbers on the board. You can stop any time you want. But this is part of their PR strategy, and it has been for a long time. The Israeli state, the far-right Zionist Israeli state's PR strategy has always been to cynically weaponize accusations of anti-Semitism, which, for one, discredits actual accusations of anti-Semitism, and I've been no stranger to calling out anti-Semitism on this program, by the way. Before I'm labeled an anti-Semite for any of this conversation, I regularly go into the history of the Holocaust. I go into the history of anti-Semitism in America, the history of anti-Semitism in the entire world, and I regularly stand in solidarity with progressive Jewish people and Israelis who oppose the far-right Zionist government in Israel. There is not a logical claim to calling me an anti-Semite unless you are literally cynically weaponizing the term, which is a disservice to actual anti-Semitism, which then makes actual victims of anti-Semitism harder to protect and harder to prevent those instances. I wrote, the pivotal PR element of the far-right Zionist government in Israel has been to weaponize the trauma Jewish people experienced from the Holocaust in order to silence any opposition to the Israeli state's heinous actions against Palestine. You're seeing it play out again with success, and this was October 9th. It has only gotten worse. You have the literal defense minister of Israel proudly calling Palestinians animals and saying he'll commit collective punishment against their civilian population, and if you call that out, you're an anti-Semite, so your opposition to war crimes is invalid. If you call that out, you're a Hamas supporter or Hamas sympathizer, so your opposition to war crimes is invalid. Your opposition to the deaths of civilians and children is invalid. That's not how that works, man. I'm sorry. The propaganda might, create conditions that allow for that in our media, but that's not how that happens. History will not see that kindly. And of course, Western media is lapping it up. Like, it is incredibly easy for me to condemn the brutality against civilians by Hamas, the terror group of Hamas, and by the far-right Israeli government and the IDF. I don't know why it's so hard for people who support Israel to do the same, right? You can support the right for Israel to exist as a nation state and for the civilian population in Israel for being safe. Why is it so hard for you to do the same when it comes to Palestinians? To oppose Hamas but support the Palestinian civilians, half of which are children. Why is this so difficult? It's almost like there's an agenda here. It's almost like people have bought into the PR, the propaganda framing of Palestine as all being members of Hamas, all being terrorists, and therefore all fair game for essentially death in war. Because they don't want Palestine to exist. Because they don't want Palestinians to exist. Because they want a one-state solution where Israel is the only state and Palestine is just a memory. It's Islamophobic, and frankly, it's anti-Semitic. Because a lot of this anti-Semitism that you'll see stems from far-right Zionists who end up literally just making the Israeli government look bad by these atrocities, which then unfortunately makes all Jewish people look bad, because the same thing is at play when it comes to people who are anti-Semitic when they equate every single Jewish person or every single Israeli with the far-right government that currently has power there, because that is not the case either. I can understand this in Palestine and in Israel. I don't know why it's so hard for people who support Israel to do. And it's not to say that all people who support not the government in Israel, but the people of Israel, but there are a lot of people who support that government and have difficulty with this. And I just don't understand why. Outside of the fact that you are just, anti-Palestine, anti-Muslim, and you're either willing to look away from it or you're in favor of Palestine being wiped off the map. And I just can't support that. I don't know if there's anything else I have to say on the topic. But yeah, those are my takes. If you've been wondering why I haven't posted a video on it yet, it's mostly because I like to wait on things like this. And also, if you watch me long enough, you will have heard some of these takes already, how I am very free Palestine. But here, is the full video on the topic. It's likely that there might be new developments in the story when it comes to Israel's war against Palestine that I may or may not be able to add in before this video goes live. So I don't know if we'll put a follow-up video, but if you want to see my continued commentary on it, you can follow me on Twitter. That's where I post about it the most. Yeah. It's difficult to, see positive things in a moment like this, especially if you're a normal human being and have access to this wonderful ability called empathy for your fellow human being. It's very tough on the mental, obviously, especially if you are in Palestine or, in the surrounding territories, surrounding countries, or have family there, or are Muslim in America, or are Jewish in America. Shit's really fucking hard right now. And even just being a supporter of Palestinian liberation from their apartheid conditions and oppression, shit's difficult. And I can understand people wanting a break from that. So I'm not going to continually make videos unless something else is immediately jumping out. My other videos will, hopefully remain some kind of reprieve, even though I talk about a lot of heavy shit pretty frequently. So I guess you're kind of used to it. Anyway, I'm rambling at this point. Take care of yourself. Free Palestine. Solidarity with progressive Israelis who oppose their far-right government. Solidarity with progressive Jewish people who oppose the far-right Israeli government. Solidarity with Palestinians who oppose Hamas and are fighting for their liberation. Solidarity with all people who support everything I've just mentioned. And, yeah. Be careful out there.